ado, I'd like to introduce our Executive Director at NJSACC, Ms. Diane Janko.
Hi guys, happy summer. Thank you all. I know this is a quick turnaround time, and thank you, Brian, for joining us. Brian Ross is from New Jersey's Department of Children and Families, DCF, so that's where the Office of Licensing is housed. And Brian is the Assistant Commissioner for Legal, Regulatory, and Legislative Affairs for the New Jersey Department of Children and Families. Some of you may have seen him on the, if you were on the ACNJ call, or also right in the beginning when the new regs were announced for childcare with the two commissioners from Human Services and DCF. So I unfortunately may not be here for the whole call, so I'm handing the whole monitoring off to Ebony Grace, and she will do a lovely job, and I will still be monitoring it. And thank you all for coming. And Brian, thank you so much. We really appreciate this. So
very happy
Ebony,
to.
you're on.
Good afternoon, Mr. Ross. It's nice to meet you. I'm Ebony Grace. I'm the Director of Partnerships and Quality Initiatives with NJSACC. So we're really glad to have you with us today, and we really appreciate your time. So as I know Diane told you, over the past few months, we've provided held open provider calls for the school-age providers here in New Jersey that are licensed, subsidized. And so what we've been doing is kind of amassing questions that we've been getting in terms of just the health and safety guidelines in regards to the pandemic and COVID-19 and how to implement quality healthy and safe programs. So I'm just going to go through some of the questions. Slow me down if you need to. I do tend to talk, speak fast, but or if you need any clarification. So I'll just be going through. I am my Zoom is in front of my camera's in front of me, but my questions are on another monitor right above it. So just so it doesn't look like I am paying attention.
Notice even.
So our first question is, what is quote unquote recommended and what is required, quote unquote?
So really, it's a good question. I know as we go through the health and safety standards, which I assume everybody has seen, most everything in there is required. It's, you know, there are some things where we're encouraging or we're requiring things like with the face mask, which has been one of the more controversial issues that we're requiring you to encourage. So it's a standard that's a little bit trying to have it both ways, where we are requiring you to encourage kids to use those face masks, but not actually requiring the kids to wear them. You know, for the most part, everything else, we are looking for good health and safety standards, good sanitation practices, really keeping up that social distancing, but there is a lot of flexibility within that. We know that there are some folks who have certain standards and practices that they've adhered to, whether they're open as emergency centers or just really coming back into this, really very concerned and very conscientious about what they're doing, that they are exceeding those standards or doing things in a slightly different way. So I don't believe the standards are at any point overly prescriptive about how these things need to be implemented, but there are a few things, and if they are specified in there, we're generally requiring those to be done.
Okay, thank you. And I'm sure that people will have follow-up questions, as I like 3 came up at the moment, but I'm just gonna, I'll just move forward as we go, and then we just encourage people to put your questions into the chat as we go through, and then we'll try to make sure that we get through as many as possible.
Sounds great, and I apologize, by the way, welcome back, everybody. We hope you're having a great time opening back up. I've got 3 kids running around who will inevitably make an appearance here, but if you can hear them in the background, I apologize.
Brian, I always say on our calls, never apologize for your children, for hearing your children, because we know that that is a part of our regular lives and especially part of our COVID lives. So you never need to apologize. So, but thank you. Okay, so the next question is, can the Office of Licensing come out to do alternate or license alternate spaces quickly if needed?
Absolutely. So we are very happy to get out there as quickly as possible to approve those alternate spaces. We've also continued the regulatory waiver for the play space requirements. So requirements in the manual, which require a certain degree of indoor and outdoor play space, we've waived those as a precaution to try and make sure that that extra space that you may have in your facilities already is available for class space and for regular square footage for your managing to keep kids there and socially distanced. So, but if you have additional spaces within an approved facility, adjacent to an approved facility, we are happy to get somebody out there rapidly to make sure we get that approved quickly.
Okay, so rapid approval could happen for alternate spaces if they're already a part of an approved space. Did I understand that correctly?
Yeah, it does get more complicated if we're talking about a separate facility. Not so much on the licensing side. I think we can, we're very committed to getting people out there as quickly as possible to do that. It does get a little bit more complicated when we need municipal and fire officials out there to do their various approvals and environmental approvals. And so it does get more complicated when we're talking about a wholly new space. But repurposing space within an existing facility is definitely something we can do fairly quickly.
Okay, and the turnaround time for approval, like site visit and then approval, would be pretty quick?
It's pretty quick. We're trying to do it a lot more rapidly than we normally would. It's going to vary as the demand increases, particularly as we get into September. And we normally have a little bit more to do as the school year starts up, and we're really keeping our fingers crossed, trying to see what this year will look like. But yeah, we can try to do that within a week or two at the worst at the moment.
Okay, thank you. All right, so now I'm going to move on to some health and safety questions. Who would be responsible for the health checks at sites?
So the staff at the site is responsible for that, particularly with after-school programs. We know that the kids, presumably at that point, are coming into a school for the school day, and we know there are going to be some question in each district about how that's actually going to work, and that may vary district to district, or there may be a statewide process, but we want to be sure, at least as kids are coming into a licensed child care program, that somebody is checking them on their way in and out. So that applies to staff, that applies to some of the very limited categories of visitors that are permitted there, and that unfortunately does have to be done for every child. It's a relatively quick screening. You're not doing a full physical there. You're checking a temperature and you're asking about symptoms and folks in the home who might have symptoms, but we really do need that to be done both when the children enter, if they have to leave for some reason during the day and re-enter, whether it be for a physician's appointment or other reasons they would need to leave. The check needs to be done every single time they come in and out.
Okay.
So that would be on the daycare staff.
Okay, so that would be under the staff. And when you say out, that's only if they're coming back into the program the same day?
Yeah.
Okay, thank you. And how does this need to be documented?
So there is an online form that has been sent out to all licensed centers. So it's a daily log. You're going to put the name down, the temperature down, and there's a couple of yes and no check boxes. So that's all online. I can't remember the name of the software product we are just using, but it's they do nice work. It's relatively user friendly. They're the same folks who've done we've all been watching the COVID tracker at Johns Hopkins. They put that set together. We have a contract with them to do a real quick daily survey. It takes a couple of minutes per kit. A couple of minutes to fill out. You just fill in the name, the temperature, and like I said, a yes or no box, and that gets then transmitted to the Office of Licensing.
Okay, thank you. And where do the screenings take place to ensure privacy of information?
So that's really going to vary. So we've got a little bit of flexibility there in the regulations. We do require that it be a separate space. If it's indoors, it needs to be segregated from the rest of the building. We highly recommend in most cases that be done outdoors if that's a problem to have a segregated space indoors, which for most centers it really is. It's space is at a premium. We understand that. So we do have some centers that have set up, outside in an entry vestibule. Others who are actually going up to the car and doing it there. Parents are dropping kids off, doing it on the sidewalk out front, some kind of a segregated space. We've seen tents up. Summertime is obviously easier. We know most of these after-school programs, you're obviously a little more focused on the fall and winter as the weather stops to be quite as conducive for that. So it really is going to vary depending on your facility. We understand they're going to need to be creative, but there needs to be some area at entry that is segregated and available for folks to do that screening at. One of the really common misperceptions about the regulations that we've been getting questions about is that there does not need to be a sink right there. So it does indicate the children need to wash their hands when they come in. A lot of folks have understood that to mean that they need to have a sink waiting there at the front door, and some folks have even asked about installing sinks there at the front door. That's not necessary. We need to bring them into the facility and then send them to the sink, but that doesn't need to be something that's installed right there before they enter the center.
Okay, thank you. And do providers need to take temperatures at the beginning of after school? So, and I know we've also got questions if it's a school-based program, their temperature is taken at the beginning of the day when they first enter school. So does the temperature need to be taken again at the beginning of the after-school program, especially if it's on site?
Unfortunately, right now, the answer is yes. We are working with the Department of Education. There's a good likelihood we're going to have further guidance on that as we get into the school year. But right now, because of the uncertainty of the way schools are going to re-enroll, we are requiring that to be done whenever a kid goes in and out of a licensed program, which would include leaving the program to go to school and then coming back into the program. So I know that's a cop-out answer. I apologize. But for now, yes. hopefully by the fall, we'll have a better process in place to make that a little bit easier for everybody to move kids back and forth when they're in the same building.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you. And what about the timing of temperature taking? Is it just upon entry, or should they be taking it again at noon or later in the day? Or
we're only requiring it at entry. Obviously, if a kid exhibits symptoms of COVID-19 or you have other concerns about their health, we would not discourage you from taking it again, but we're only requiring it at entry.
Okay. Alrighty. So who will check the students' temperatures before getting on the bus to be transported to the program? Wouldn't it be more effective to take temperatures in the afternoon when readings are most likely to see spikes? Temperature readings, that is.
So the buses, again, that's something we're hoping to work out with education. We really only have jurisdiction at Children and Families over the license program itself. So if the school bus is, I know education is working hard, and there is promise of some guidance this week, which I think we're all pretty anxious to see. And I'm not sure what I think they've settled on some details, and I'm going to try and not trip over myself to reveal things I'm not certain about, but because I really don't know. I hear the same rumors everybody else does. We're really hoping there'll be some school bus guidance included in that. But for now, we're going to have to save that for future guidance too, unfortunately. So right now, we're really concerned about the front door of the child care program, whether they get there by bus, whether they're brought there by their parents. That's when the temperature check needs to occur. As far as taking in the afternoon, yes, we do understand that's when the temperatures are more likely to spike. Our concern is trying to screen for symptoms early in the day before they enter the program. It's much more valuable for the program to find out that the kid is symptomatic before they've been admitted and exposed to everybody in the center than it is to find out after the fact. So we're really concerned about if a kid is symptomatic, if there is a temperature, if there are other symptoms that this sounds cold when I say it this way, but we want to keep that kid out of that program so that the other kids in the program aren't exposed that way. So yes, we agree, and we don't discourage you from taking a temperature in the afternoon if you feel it's appropriate. But for our purposes, we're only really concerned about that initial entry screening.
Okay, thank you. And what will be the involvement of the school nurse in the implementation of the guidelines?
That's going to vary by program. Again, we don't have authority over that particular nurse. We really only have regulatory authority over the child care program. So who does the actual screening is really going to vary by program. If the nurse is available to you, I would highly encourage you to work with the school and work with that nurse to make that happen. But we don't have real authority over that.
Okay, thank you. So here's a multiple part question. What will happen if schools and programs are opened and then there's a spike in the virus and schools and or other facilities need to close? What is the plan?
I can't answer that at that point. I think we're all very worried about that. I think the child care programs will likely follow the lead of the schools. So we are unlikely to deviate from that. So the school buildings do close, and that's obviously a possibility that we're contemplating and trying to prepare for, but child care programs are likely to follow suit if they're in the same building.
So the next set of questions have to do with spacing and ratios, staff and youth ratios. So how is the 10-foot spacing carried out for groups of 10? Is the square footage per room still mandated?
So the square footage per room is still mandated, or at least the amount of space that's required per child. What we're requiring is there be 10 feet or a barrier of some kind between the groupings. So this does not mean that the kids need to be separated within their groupings. We actually have done away with all social distancing requirements within the group. So the 10 kids can be a lot closer than the 6 feet that we would look for previously. We need either 10 feet of space or we need a physical barrier in between. A lot of programs can accommodate that within one room. You can have, if you have a large gymnasium, you can have a set of kids every 10 feet across the room. There just needs to be a 10-foot radius around that group to the next group. So the furthest out kid within the diameter of a group needs to be 10 feet from the next group over. And we know that there has been a little bit of controversy because 6 feet is kind of the standard we've all gotten used to over the last 3 months. And there obviously is a little bit of wiggle room in here because we're dealing with kids. We understand that 6 feet is the barrier we're trying not to break. So there is an additional 4 feet built in so that there's a little bit of wiggle room for kids who might need a little bit of extra space to be controlled that way.
Okay, thank you. And what about the 1 to 15 ratio?
So we're at a 1 to 10 ratio right now. We have had discussions with the folks at Health, and we are moving into phase 2 slowly. So for at least the foreseeable future, we are sticking with the 1 to 10. As we move into you know, particularly as if schools were to adopt a higher ratio, we were likely to follow suit on that. But at this point, that decision hasn't been made.
Okay.
And as far as those ratios go, we would clarify that that really means kids. So it's 10 kids to a group. That does not include staff. So if you have 10 kids in a group, your requisite staff needs to be there at the same time.
Do you need a moment?
I apparently do. So I will be back momentarily.
Fine.
I just wanted to take this opportunity, Ed, to just say you're doing a great job and to thank everyone again for joining us. I know the questions are a bit fast and furious, but we're trying to do our best to cover all of your concerns, or as many as possible. Again, we will be bundling up questions that are unanswered and we will be sending them to DCF, and we will be providing updates as we receive them to those additional questions. Eb, if you could, when Brian comes back, just remind him just to slow down a little bit. It's such good information, but with the, of course, the through no fault of his own, with some of the background noise and the quick talking, some of it is hard to hear. So if you could slow down just a little bit, you're fine. But for him, if he could slow down a little bit, that would be more ideal. But so far, everything is coming through clearly and great.
Fabulous. Thanks, Adam. It's ironic that I'm not the one talking too fast, but that's, normally it's me. But I think because I'm reading questions, I'm like trying to read them clearly. So that's not the issue. But yeah, thank you for everyone for your patience. I do see questions in the chat. Hi, how are you? All right. So Brian, we just asked if you could just slow down a little bit when you're responding to the questions. I said it's ironic because normally I'm the one that's talking too fast, but I think that because I'm reading, it's probably slowing me down a bit.
Happy to slow down. So I do see the question asking for clarification on the 10 kids in one room. Yes, the 10 kids in one group, and you know, we say one room, we really mean one group. You can have 100 kids in one room as long as there's sufficient space to separate those groups of 10 by 10 feet. But the kids within a group can be closer than 6 feet. They can be touching. They can be right next to each other. You know, these rules were written with infants and toddlers in mind. We don't expect them to remain 6 feet away from people. When we get into, you asked about non-contact sports are perfectly acceptable. Working at the same table is perfectly acceptable. When we get into those things, the bigger concern is the sharing of equipment and balls. You know, we want to make sure that whatever equipment, be it markers, crayons, toys, so that they're sharing at a work table are things that can be cleaned and sanitized between groups. We're trying to keep those groups small, stable, and consistent so that there isn't germ being spread between the various groups. Things that can't be cleaned, so we're talking about plush toys, we're talking about other things that you really can't just quickly Lysol down. Want to make sure we have those, to the extent that's possible, limited one per kid, so that those aren't being shared, and they aren't being shared between groups. But within groups, balls, other things that can be wiped down are perfectly acceptable.
Okay, thank you. Let's see. Alternate spaces are used and those spaces do not meet licensing requirements. Will those requirements be waived or loosened?
Really depends on the requirement. For physical space, we really are bound and have a difficult time waiving things significantly because a lot of what we're looking at is fire code and construction code. So we want to waive things a lot of times, and we'll see that there are definitely ways where we would understand what you want to do, but we really are still bound by some of those health and safety codes from the external parties. So if it's a fire code violation, they're very unlikely to waive that, and we unfortunately don't have the power to do that. Well, I say unfortunately. We wish we could do it for you, but we're really not in a position to argue with the fire marshals, unfortunately.
Okay. And so can you give some suggestions for what are some alternative space options?
So we've definitely looked at, again, those play spaces are definitely something that people have when the emergency centers are operating. If they had access to a gymnasium, to a larger indoor play space, those are definitely areas that can be converted into classroom spaces. That's not ideal under normal conditions because obviously we want play space to be available, but at the same time, we understand space is very much at a premium, and if it can be converted to play space, that's definitely something we'd like to do, particularly because shared spaces become a little bit more problematic. We do want kids to be kept separated, so you aren't going to be using the gym as you would as an open playground where you would have 100 kids out there at a recess, for example, running around, because you need to keep the group segregated for those times too. So it does become a little more feasible to share some of that potential larger play space. We've seen a lot of folks who've divided classrooms up with barriers, which has helped make space a little bit more efficient. It can be difficult in rooms that are not quite large enough for two groups, but if you have a large enough classroom space, you can put a barrier down the middle. You don't need to keep 10 feet there. There just needs to be some kind of a physical barrier in between the kids that's high enough that it stops folks from breathing on one another.
Okay. And I think I may already know the answer to this, but just to be clear, will programs not be allowed to run in alternate spaces if licensing requirements aren't met?
Yeah, I'm going to give a cop-out answer there too. Hi, this is Maggie. She says hello.
Hi, Maggie.
If there are rules that we can waive and they're reasonable accommodations, licensing rules we will waive. Unfortunately, a lot of those requirements come back to your fire code and construction code, and we can't promise that those are waivable. So that really relies on officials that don't work for my office or for the state. Usually those are local officials, so we really don't necessarily have authority to actually waive those. So unfortunately, I can't give a straight answer on that. We'll do our best to accommodate as best we can. We want to make sure whatever space you have available is readily usable, and we don't intend to stand in anybody's way. We understand the conditions, but sometimes that fire code really is inflexible for a reason. So,
absolutely. Okay, thank you. Supplies. We just have a couple of questions there. Must each student have their own supplies or their own supply kit?
Not necessarily. So again, if there's supplies that can be cleaned and they're shared within groups, that's okay under the guidance. You can share markers, you can share crayons. To the extent that you're able to not do that, we would encourage you not to do so, but we're not requiring that they be separate kits. If they are items that can't be cleaned, we would ask that you keep those separated. So plush toys, fabric, anything that is hard to clean or difficult or impossible to clean, we would ask that kids have their own in those cases. But the things that are most commonly shared, markers, pens, scissors, things that can be Lysoled down pretty quickly, those things can still be shared.
Okay, thank you. In terms of meals and snacks, will kids eat in classrooms or in a cafeteria?
So it's much easier for them to eat in classrooms. Our guidance isn't strict on that. We do say that the place has to be clean and thoroughly sanitized in between usages if you are using a lunchroom. But that, if that's something that is more feasible for a program, we do have the flexibility to allow it. We are not requiring the kids eat in their classrooms. The feasibility of letting them eat in their classrooms is a whole lot higher. You're going to have logistically much easier for you to keep them in classrooms than to have to sanitize the cafeteria every time a group goes in and out. But we understand programs are different, and we've left that flexibility in place if there are folks that would choose to still use the lunchroom.
Okay.
You will only have one group in the lunchroom at a time, or you will have to continue to separate them by 10 feet or whatever.
Okay.
Your brother will take care.
Okay. So, and what about children with allergies? They had to have space to ensure safety if they're in the rooms.
Right, and I wasn't sure which allergies are we concerned about. I'm not sure if there's more detail on that question.
There isn't, but I'll say we get a lot of questions about peanut allergies, food allergies, things of that nature.
Right. So, I mean, every kid can be different. We obviously do need to accommodate those at the same time that we're accommodating a space. So that may be a kid that we're going to need to accommodate extra space for. It's really going to be specific to the allergies and the medical conditions that the child has.
Okay, thank you. Regarding transportation, how will youth and leadership be seated for social distancing in busing situations?
So we're actually fairly sparse. So if it's childcare provided transportation, we ask that there be social distancing on the bus, which would mean you would need to keep the kids as separated as you would in the center. For the most part, that means every other row seating, not sending groups together on the same bus unless they can be separated. There may be additional requirements on that coming out of education, which is what we anticipate is likely to be the case. So once again, we're a little bit early, and I'm happy to come back once we have some education guidance. But right now, we're still a little bit beholden to the school districts and the Department of Education on that.
Okay, and we'll definitely take you up on that for coming back when I think on a normal day, we struggle with some of the requirements and guidelines in that intersection between, childcare and school buildings. So that's always helpful.
It's not simple, yeah.
Okay, let's see. If schooling is virtual and the program operates in an alternative space, how are youth transported?
That's really going to depend on the program. We don't dictate how that needs to happen? It's a good question, because I don't know which districts will be running buses for that service. Some may not. Some may require parents. It's that's really going to depend on the school districts.
Okay, thank you. And this is our last set of questions regarding virtual school in the fall. If a center does open for full-time fall, if school is virtual, will subsidies be adjusted for full day care?
So that's a question I would have to defer to the Department of Human Services. I believe that's their intent, but I know a lot of decisions are still being made there too. That has been the case during the emergency period when I think everyone was subsidized. We paid for everybody in that case, but what the school year will look like, and again, there is a lot on the table for education. I know they've talked about alternative schedules, they've talked about half-day schedules, they've talked about all variation of plans for schooling. So obviously there will need to be some adjustment to the way subsidies are paid. But what those details look like is not public yet, or I don't think frankly even decided yet.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thank you. And do you know what all parents have to pay? Has there been any discussion about fees, you know, what the pay scale or pay rate, how that will change?
I don't believe there has yet, so I don't know. I would have to, Natasha Johnson is the director of that division, or I'm sorry, the assistant commissioner over that division, and she would be the best person to address that. Unfortunately, I don't know at this point.
Okay. And then our last question from our list of questions, are childcare programs then responsible for ensuring youth complete virtual learning assignments or requirements if there's, you know, full day virtual schooling in the fall?
So this will be my recurring broken record answer, but at this point, we've not required it of our after school programs, but we are anticipating further guidance once education has put out their guidance on schooling. If there is a huge reliance on virtual learning or distance learning in that school guidance, which is a lot of anticipation that there will be, we are very likely at that point to not only put out emergency guidance to after school programs, but to actually amend the regulations to address what the responsibility of those after school programs is to provide that. So we would definitely be interested in the feedback from your membership here, because it's obviously something that we're venturing to new territory. We understand that is a tax on your staffing and something that may require additional equipment, additional resources, a lot more attention for each individual attendee at your after school programs. But at this point, it really is in flux based on what the folks at education decided when the individual school districts do. So our inclination is definitely towards building in some regulatory responsibility in those after school programs to cooperate or at least work out arrangements with the school to make that possible. And to have the necessary equipment for that to be possible too. But at this point, it really is a matter of determining what the actual expectations from the schools will be.
Okay. Well, thank you very much. I appreciate your response to all those questions, because I know it's a lot of information, but I also know that you get the importance and the urgency of the situation.
We understand, and yeah, really with and we talked with it, you know, the centers that deal with the younger kids too, that really so much of this is going to depend on what the school districts do, whether that be a statewide approach or whether that be an individualized approach district to district. That the childcare industry as a whole really has so many different roles to play in whatever those plans are and whatever that strategy looks like. So we understand there's a lot of questions out there, and I think a lot more will be clear once we have a little more clarity on what the schools do.
Okay, thank you. So what I'm going to do is my wonderful colleagues have pulled out some of the chat questions for us. So I'm just going to start to read through some of the chats questions that we have. If the schools are closed, i.e. for virtual learning in the fall, will childcare programs or after school programs do the same and close?
So that will, for the most part, be dependent on your arrangement with the school that you're playing host to. Some of them we found, you know, the only thing we can really base this on is what happened when schools initially closed at the start of the pandemic back in March. Some schools did allow the child care programs to remain in place and to operate for the children of emergency workers and others who needed care in those facilities. Some of them just said, we're closing the building down and nobody can operate here. You need to find an alternative site. So that really is, all the liability and all the maintenance questions are on the school district itself. And we really don't have authority to mandate that they do it one way or the other. So it's really going to be what your school district decides.
Okay. What is an approved barrier?
So good question. So initially we tried to put some real clear guidance out for that. And what we found is that what is good for childcare purposes is usually bad for the fire code. What we have found is most successful is And these are available. I know Home Depot, Lowe's, Amazon all have it's essentially a plastic sheet that can be pulled down. So for our purposes, it just needs to be above the head of the tallest person who's working there, and above obviously the kids' heads, so they can't be breathing over it. So what we've seen is essentially like a thick plastic garage door that can be pulled down, or not, it's flimsy or flexible, almost like cloth. For our purposes, you could hang a bed sheet up and it would be good enough, but definitely work with your local fire officials about visibility if you're using something that's not transparent. Cubicle walls are something that people have used. If you know, obviously in an office, you would have something that's roughly head level. That would do the trick for our purposes. But just make sure there is still some degree of visibility to the exit so that there aren't issues with the fire code.
Okay, thank you. Someone asked, are we allowed to use school space? She's getting conflicting answers. Some people are saying that school buildings are closed.
Again, that really comes back to the school district itself and their access to their space. We do know some school districts are allowing childcare programs to use their actual physical space, but the arrangement has to be made with the school district itself. So they're the ones who own their space, control the liability over it, the maintenance, and make it available. So I'm not aware that the state has mandated that space can't be used, just that classes can't be conducted.
Gotcha. Okay. Let's see. If schools are requiring masks and 6 feet apart and our program is in the schools, will we need to follow suit?
Again, that comes back to your arrangement with the school. We're not requiring it. Again, ours is a little bit more lenient. We allow groups to be within, you know, as long as they're kept in groups of 10 and separated by 10 feet between groups. We don't require that 6 foot of distancing, and we encourage but don't require masks. But if the school, as part of the arrangement for the use of that space, they want that is something that needs to be negotiated with the school.
Okay, thank you. And forgive me if you said this before, but I'm going to read the question just so it's answered in the way that they asked. Since a group can play together, can they share supplies amongst each other, i.e. Legos, board games, art supplies, without cleaning in between?
Yes, they can.
In between use. Okay.
Yeah, we definitely want them cleaned between groups.
Yeah.
And obviously, if it can be avoided, if it's particularly things that are likely to absorb germs and so forth, it'd be, you know, as much cleaning as possible. But we don't require cleaning of shared supplies within a group.
Okay, great, thank you. Let's see, for after-school programs, only one group of 10 can use the playground at a time. Does equipment have to be cleaned before another group can use it?
Yes, it does.
Okay. Let's see. I'm not sure if you're going to be able to answer this question, but I'm going to ask, will DOE be coming out with guidelines that are for the whole state, or will it be up to the individual districts to come up with their own plans for guidance and opening?
I don't know. I'd have to defer to DOE. I expect there'll be some degree of both. Yeah, as with most of these things, it's hard to micromanage it down to the specific details in every district. But you know, consistent across the state for the most part, the administration has preferred a statewide approach, and I expect that largely will be the case. But I expect there will be some flexibility for districts too. But that's purely speculative.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Let's see, if a summer camp is under the Department of Health, do we still need approval from licensing for alternate space?
We do not. No, Department of Health has, if it's a summer camp and it's licensed there, we would defer to the Department of Health.
Thank you. Will there be a waiver to extend any licenses that need to be renewed in January?
Absolutely. So right now we've pushed just about everything over the summer back by about 3 months, and we would expect to probably do the same. So we're definitely not rushing to renew things. So if conditions are persisting, we're likely to continue to push back a month at a time. So if you're coming renewal in January, we'd probably expect it's going to be March or April before we would expect to actually start that renewal process, and we'll extend the license accordingly.
Okay, thank you. Okay, so this is a bit of a longer question. My program is due to be relicensed this year. They're in the 3rd year of 3 on their current license. Has there been any consideration about extending our licenses for another year?
We haven't gone so far as to say a year yet. We're mostly doing it a few months at a time. You know, as circumstances evolve in the fall, we may look at a longer period. But right now we are extending the licenses themselves. We're extending the expectation that the carry and pre-checks be done. We're really just going with the existing documentation for at least 3 months at a time further, and that's likely to extend further.
Okay.
So a whole year, it's not quite yet, but you know, really, I think we're all looking to the crystal ball, trying to see how this thing's going to continue to evolve, and that may be something that's on the table later.
Absolutely. Your daughter is awesome.
She's liking seeing herself.
I'm sure. Okay, so part of that same question, if our schools open virtually, we can't operate. Having one clear answer for all of us in this situation would be great. In much of the guidance, a lot of responsibility has been placed on the local departments of health, especially if someone in the program tests positive, and a decision has to be made about the program closing. How is your office involved with the local departments of health? Do they have your guidelines? And what if they're really different than yours?
So our rules were developed in coordination with the Department of Health. So they're very aware of it. It was distributed to all of them. They're aware of what we're doing. Where the health would come in would really be when you have an exposure case. So you have somebody who's tested positive, who has COVID, and there is a known exposure within the center. At that point, they're going to make the decision on whether the whole center needs to be closed, whether a particular wing or classroom can be sanitized and the program can reoperate pretty quickly. They're going to look at the contact tracing and the various other things that need to be done to really assess the degree of exposure and danger to keeping the center open. So that's really true for everything. Whatever the business or program is, if there's an exposure incident, we have reason to believe that the particular site is going to cause a risk to the general public or the folks who are involved with it. They're going to make the decision on whether it needs to be closed or operations suspended or curtailed or otherwise restricted in some way or the other. So we and everybody else in the state defers to the Department of Health and the local departments of health at that point. So it should be consistently applied, but they are aware of our guidelines. And really when they get involved, it's when something all of our guidelines are really aimed at preventing that exposure and trying to control for it and make sure that everything is done in a way that minimizes the impact. But once the exposure has occurred, they're really there to assess what actually happened and what needs to be done to stop it at that point.
Okay, thank you. Next question comment is, I was informed that for summer camp, youth are not permitted to leave the premises for any reason, including field trips, walking trips, etc. Is this accurate information?
I believe that is accurate. I'm not entirely sure about walking trips. The field trips have definitely been curtailed both in our programs and elsewhere, but I'm not sure about walking trips.
Okay, something that would probably need to be confirmed with the Department of Health?
Yes, absolutely.
Are these playground regulations likely to change, be loosened before fall? This basically means no kids on the playground.
I think everything is likely to be at least reassessed by fall, and I think we'll know more. I think the research on playgrounds and surfaces and other things is really evolving, and we're learning more. And we want to be consistent. We really don't want to be in a situation where we have different rules for childcare and schools. So if the playground is being utilized for school purposes, we're likely to try and come into conformity with that too. So I would say there's a high likelihood that we are going to revisit this before the school year starts. To what degree and to what that will actually look like, it's hard
to think.
Because again, we don't want where we have getting used by the same kids at the same playground.
Brian, I'm sorry, you froze a little bit. Do you mind saying just like the last 30 seconds?
Sure. So I said, yes, we're very likely to revisit those. I don't know about the specifics of that, but we want to make sure that we're in alignment with what the schools are requiring and what their expectations are and the camps and everybody else, because we really don't want to be in a position where we have 3 sets of regulations or rules pertaining to the same playground.
Okay, thank you. If a child has a temperature when they get to the program, does the program take them in, or does the school district claim responsibility for the child until the parents pick them up?
So we would, we will look for a plan in that regard. If the child has a temperature over 100.4, they can't be admitted to the child care program. What can happen with an after-school program where obviously the parents aren't there is we can have space set aside within the program that's specifically designated for sick kids, or we can have that arrangement made with the school. So your inspector will look for an arrangement that's been made one way or the other. It really doesn't matter for our purposes what that is, whether that's the school that keeps them or the program that keeps them. That does need to be worked out with the school district. The only rule that really is very hard and fast is they can't be admitted to the actual school program.
Okay, thank you. Does waiting 24 hours between use of the playground waive the sanitizing between groups? So group A gets to use it Monday, group B gets to use it Tuesday, et cetera, et cetera.
I would have to look into that. That's I'm not sure. I think that would make sense. I believe that's consistent with the science we've heard, but I'll make a note of that, and we'll try and get some guidance out further on that, because I don't want to speak to the science of it, and I'm not real sure.
Okay, thank you. Understanding that a maintenance techs aren't allowed unless there is an emergency, are there any other exceptions regarding maintenance needs? Do food deliveries need to be dropped off at the entranceway if the main door is used, or can they come in for deliveries?
So maintenance, no. The only exception built in there for that is emergency maintenance. So that is a fairly loose term, and we understand that means, initially we said there were no maintenance work. It had to be done after hours unless there was an actual emergency that couldn't be fixed. The governor's office actually brought up when we sent that forward, if the air conditioner breaks down in the middle of July, we expect somebody to come in and fix it. So it does need to qualify as an emergency, and for maintenance workers, we would expect most routine work, anything that can wait for after hours when kids are not present, to wait for after hours when kids are not present. But we're happy to answer individual questions if there are issues with, again, access to a physical premises. Schools are likely to be subject to the same, because the intent is to minimize visitors in and out of the building. So maintenance that's being provided by a school is likely to be subject to the same rules, where they're going to try and minimize work that's being done in the presence of children and staff. As far as food deliveries, we would, yes, those would, unless there are special circumstances or aggravating circumstances, there we'd expect those to be dropped outside so that there aren't staff coming in from the catering company into the building and interacting with children and staff. If there are circumstances that make that unfeasible, we would work with you to try and work out arrangements so that they could come in through an entrance where they would not be exposed to children and staff, and we can minimize that contact, because the goal really is to make sure that we're not bringing outside persons, particularly people who are interacting with several different communities in a day. So if you have a delivery person who's potentially making arrangement or making deliveries and dropping food off or serving food at multiple schools or multiple centers in a given day, that is a pretty significant exposure risk there. So we would want to make sure that we're keeping them separated. So the rule based on the standards is no, they need to drop it off outside and it can be carried in by the staff. But if that's not workable, we can definitely work with you to find out something that is.
Okay, thank you. Let's see. Could you go into specific standards for an isolation space for children who become ill while in your program? Does it need to be a separate room or just a space blocked off by a physical barrier? Space blocked off by a physical barrier does the trick too. That I would just refer back to the regulations that govern sick space in the child care manual. So it doesn't need to be an entirely separate room. It just needs to be a space that's segregated from the other kids, and that there is no commingling of staff and kids between that room too. So if we have an exposed kid or a kid who's symptomatic, we do not want that staff to be wandering back and forth between rooms. So that can obviously be something to consider, but no, it does not need to be the actual physical separate room. Okay. Are we allowed to combine children in aftercare that were not together during the school day?
Yes, you are. It's not ideal. I mean, if you're in a situation where you can keep kids with the classroom group that they were with all day, that's obviously preferable, but we understand that's logistically just not real feasible for most centers, and that groups are going to have to be combined that weren't together during the day. It's not ideal, but it's really not something that can be worked around.
Okay. In some cases, airflow is an issue. Can doors of a, say, gym allowed to be propped open, windows or, doors or windows be allowed to be propped open on a ground floor?
Yes.
Okay, so gym doors and windows can be propped open.
Right. I mean, we obviously would expect there to be some controls in place to make sure folks aren't slipping in and out of those doors as they're propped open, but we definitely, in the health and safety guidance, encourage you to keep the windows open, make sure the airflow is as good as it can be, make sure your HVAC systems are in good working order. But if windows and doors can be propped open safely, we would definitely encourage you to do so. Okay.
Just looking at, does this apply? Okay, I think they're referring to the maintenance question. Does this apply for third-party maintenance techs? Is it okay for non-child care staff to work in the building while children are in the building?
Sure, and I think in schools we expect that's probably the case. Where we'd be concerned is if program staff who are interacting with the children, coming within those groups or having something to do with the children and staff are working in the space. So with maintenance groups, we're mostly concerned that they are moving in and out of the space where children are sitting or working or coming within that 6 feet proximity to children. In the building generally, that's obviously fine. That's not something we would be concerned about. But you know, if there are people moving in and out, and particularly we're concerned about people who might be moving in between groups. So if you had a nurse who was moving, or a special teacher, for example, we've had music teachers and others who would possibly be sitting down and doing a program with several groups in a child care center. That's something we would definitely discourage. But people who are unrelated to the program or happen to be working there and not interacting with children, we don't have an issue there.
Okay, thank you. And knowing that kids can come from various classrooms to form a group in aftercare, would the classroom need to be disinfected before we could use them?
We would encourage that, yeah.
Okay. Well, it seems that we are all answered, all the questions have been so far. So I didn't know if maybe, Adam, did you want to say something?
Yes, thank you so much. I just wanted to once again reiterate how appreciative we are of your time, Mr. Brian. Thank you so much for DCF, for your willingness to come through and answer these very important questions. And to remind everyone that we've done our very best to try to get through all of the questions. We understand it was a lot, so thank you again, everyone. I also wanted to encourage—
Can I say one thing? So
yeah,
my sense is this is an organic process.
Absolutely.
We should not panic yet, because there is an understanding that school age, when you're housed in a public school, is extremely different than an early childhood program.
Yeah.
And you're really, and correct me if I'm wrong, that you're really trying to work with DOE, which of course DOE has not released that guidance yet, and we aren't sure where it is. So you've kind of come up with best practice, but this is not written in stone.
No, and I would say organic is the best word for it. This is, you know, what we've told all centers all along, that you understand the risks, you understand what we're aiming for here. We really ask people to do their best. We want to make sure we're keeping kids safe, and that does mean separating them as best you can, sanitizing, cleaning, hand washing as best you can. I would say that as you're preparing for the next school year, a huge amount of this is going to depend on what the DOE and the schools do. We intend to release additional guidance. It almost certainly will come out before the school year starts to coordinate with whatever DOE is announced. So there's definitely no time to panic based on the guidance that's out there now. And hopefully you won't panic when the other guidance comes out too, because hopefully it'll be well understood and reasonable at that point and everybody will be happy with it. But no, I mean, where things are in the guidance right now and are clearly not going to be applicable to an after-school, before-school program, those are things that we're very likely to address. And whatever feedback you all have in particular, we would love to continue to receive that, because obviously our concerns that we aren't necessarily going to be aware of as far as how these things are being implemented on the DOE or school side that we can address too. So we're definitely, as has been the case, I think, for since March, you know, we're kind of trying to adjust to the situation as it arises and as it evolves and as the science changes and as the circumstances on the ground evolve.
Okay. We do have another question. Someone asked, in the fall, will parents still need to stay outside to sign the kids out?
Yes, they will.
Okay.
So the one the one exception that has been directed by the Attorney General's office, nursing mothers we have admitted into programs. I know that doesn't affect really any of your programs probably, but to the extent that does, that's the one exception that's been directed.
And have you, okay, she said, have you discussed propping doors with any other state agency? We have against that in our school safety plans that are submitted annually to the state. Not sure which department. It's conflicting information, at least in my district.
So if there is conflicting guidance and you're not allowed to open those doors for school safety purposes, that would overrule whatever guidance we're providing. We're interested in maximizing airflow wherever feasible. If there is conflicting rules, regulations, or plans in place, we do not supersede those. So if that's the case in the schools, then they would need to stay consistent with that.
Okay, let's see. My daycare is in Plainfield High School. As part of our program, our teen parents always come into the daycare.
I didn't quite, is it the question about teen mothers? It broke up a little bit on me.
Yeah, so I think it's the same question. So can teen moms be allowed into the teen parenting program daycare? And I believe it's the same question. They're located in Plainfield High School, and part of their program, the teen parents are allowed to come into the daycare. Does it have to stop?
For infants, that is permissible.
Okay. And then someone asked, can there be vendors outdoors, like programs outside of building on playground, for instance, as long as we distance the children?
Yes, I can. And I know there are some magicians and musicians and others who've actually put together some pretty good programs on that, where they're standing 6 to 10 feet away from the playground, outside of a fence in most cases, and doing their performance. And that's actually worked out well. A lot of folks have had some good luck with that, and that is definitely permissible as long as the distancing is maintained.
Okay. And I think someone just wanted some clarification regarding the barriers. Does it need to be a plastic shield of some sort separating the groups?
So for our purposes, it can be anything. And it can be a bed sheet, it can be cardboard, it can be plastic or plexiglass. Where the complications come up, and it's something you definitely want to talk to your local fire officials about, because the visibility can be an issue under the fire code. So if it's put up in such a way that it obstructs visibility to exit doors and other egresses, that can be a complication there. For our purposes, we just need it to be solid material that extends above the face and mouth level of the tallest person behind it. So we're really flexible. If a barrier goes up, we're willing to let that be just about anything, but you are going to need to work with your local officials to make sure they don't have
you could use cardboard.
You could.
That was, say, 4 feet high, like we use science presentation boards a lot of times to divide space up. So it can be very portable.
You're probably looking at 6 to 7 feet, because you want to be above the staff as well as the children.
7 feet. Oh, well, yeah, I guess that's really higher than I am. Yeah.
I mean, if you have short staff, we're going to go with that too. So it's you know, I'm not sure who. Right. I assume 6 feet is probably going to be above the heads of most staff in most cases. That's
so it wouldn't be a permanent installation, like you were suggesting the things from Amazon. That's like a garage door, like it sounds like it stands up.
And I can send pictures around it. Actually, the child care assistant sent it to us. There's a product that they, and it's plastic. I mean, it's flexible plastic. It's just somewhere between fabric, and it's not an actual garage door. It looks like a garage door to me, but it's really just a like a canvas sheet that pulls down. It's transparent and can do the trick for our purposes. So I think, you know, as you look around the state at places where people have, you know, various retail establishments that have allowed rate open, you see a lot of variation in the plastic plexiglass that's being stuck up, and they're subject to the same requirements. There isn't a huge amount of real clear guidance on what those need to look like, but it really just needs to make sure you're blocking whatever particle transmission might occur between people on the other side of the plastic.
Yeah, so someone asked, does the barrier need to be from the ground up, or can it be a hanging barrier?
Either one was good. Okay. If you can somehow just get it to levitate there in the middle, that's good too. But
and someone,
yeah, a thing that blocks that, you know, we're really looking at the face and mouth level. So as long as there's something there that is blocking the breathing, both from the kids who are on the a little bit lower level and the staff who are a little bit taller, that's acceptable.
Okay. Yeah, and someone made the comment that in most places you can't hang from the ceiling due to fire code.
Yeah.
I think that would be something they have to make sure that they take into consideration as well. Someone
yeah. And it's going to vary by your building, your usage class, you know, the actual physical structure, and what the local fire official, you know, there is unfortunately some wiggle room in the fire code and what each county or municipality expects out of that. So I can't promise that the answer is going to be exactly the same from place to place, depending on the standard that you're being held to. But from the officer licensing perspective, we're willing to be very, very flexible on that, as long as there's some barrier to the breathing.
And I think you may have answered this before, so I apologize for any repeats. Is there any indication on when the DOE guidelines will be provided? Because they all need time to plan and purchase supplies, of course.
I believe the governor last week said they were expecting something this week, but I can only speak to what's in the press too. I know they're working hard on them. I know we've talked to them about various aspects of that, but I don't know what their actual, aside from what's been announced
today is maybe Wednesday.
Okay, so maybe Wednesday is what we're looking at.
It was maybe today, but yeah, maybe Wednesday. I think they're getting close. But again, those are very organic.
Yeah, so, and I, you know, obviously don't envy the folks who have to make those decisions, because they're definitely complicated, and I think the situation evolves so rapidly, and so there's so much on the line that I think they want to be very careful. So we'll see what happens.
And someone asked the question, do you need a barrier when you are screening staff members?
So there are two methods that are laid out in the health and safety guidelines. One depends on the barrier. The other really just requires PPE. And you know, whichever method you choose to use is good with us. again, I think the most successful ones we've seen at the emergency centers, they were doing the screening through car windows. They were having somebody hold up a thermometer to a car window. They were looking at it. I think that's the method that a lot of the COVID testing centers have used too. When folks come in and they're checking their symptoms, they do it that way. So it's, there can be a barrier when you're checking staff, but whatever method you use for children probably is the best one to use for both.
Okay. Who would be responsible for screening staff in a morning program when no other staff are there, i.e. my, says EB staff come in at 7:15 while I start work at 8?
You know, if they're there alone, we can, let me take a picture of the thermometer, I guess. If there's two there, they can definitely screen one another. We haven't been real clear on that.
Yeah.
It is permissible to take your own temperature. We've actually encouraged that in some places, whether it be children or that be the staff. A lot of families, you know, particularly this was an issue back in March and April when thermometers were really difficult to get a hold of. You know, the guidance was just have the family bring their own and just show it to you on their way in. So it's not a problem to take your own temperature and do that screening, but we want to make sure that it's done. That at least the staff member who we're trusting with it is taking their temperature in the morning. And yeah, that would be my recommendation there too, is that they record their own temperature with a thermometer.
Okay. And someone just asked the question, and we're almost at 12:59, so this will be the last question. Please confirm if the barrier is only for sick children, or can we have groups closer than 10 feet if there is a barrier?
You can definitely have them, but barriers work in place of that 10-foot separation for any groups. And I think particularly centers that have a limited amount of space, that's definitely the option to utilize. So that's not just sick children, that's any children. And I think somebody did post in the chat a link to the product we were talking about, which thank you for doing that. That's extremely helpful. And that would work. I'm trying to scroll back up to it, but
Brian, sometimes programs use tables normally to separate and make certain interest areas. So say you had a table, like a cafeteria table, and you put a sheet over it, then that would be only like, I don't know, 3.5 feet tall. And then you could put like a science presentation board, a trifold board on top of that, and that would bring it up. So
yeah,
it wouldn't
that
even
would work.
all be one structure, right?
No, as long as there's something physical in that's arrangement you're describing, yeah, as long as it's rising up to a level that nobody is breathing under it or around it.
To cover, because the table has openings, you would just have to cover it to the floor, right?
Yeah,
like
that would actually, that'd be a fairly clever solution. Yeah, I think that would work well.
Okay, Jess, you're on it. You're good at that. Yes, changing spaces, excellent.
I think we are done. We don't seem to have any other questions. Diane, did you have any other questions or comments that you wanted to add before we close out?
Okay, now I may be like crazy about this, but the other day on the call with Natasha Johnson, y'all were talking about the ratio is 1 to 15. So what's the deal with 1 to 15 versus 2 to 10?
So the ratios in place remain in place as is. At this point, it really only affects, you're at a 1 to 10 ratio for just about everybody for the time being. We're likely to adjust around that as the school districts work out their ratios and DOE does. But right now, the only standard in place is a 1 to 10 ratio because we need to have at least some commonality between the children and the staffing. So we have a de facto ratio of 1 to 10 for all groups except for infants, but we're likely to revisit that.
Okay, that makes me feel better. All right, good. All right, good.
And my own comment, Jack, I just wanted to make sure that there's some requests for us sharing a recording of this today. Is that okay with you?
Absolutely, yeah.
Thank you so much.
So Brian, we know that different licensing inspectors have different hotspots or different ways they interpret things. So right. I guess what our purpose today was, we all wanted to be on the same page. So say, for example, a licensing inspector said, oh, that's not plausible. We could say, well, we had a call, and this is how the interpretation was from this individual from your department. And then they many times will go back then to the department and they'll get clarity. Is that okay to do?
Absolutely. And because we are very, very laser focused on these 8 pages worth of health and safety standards for the time being, we're really, really reiterating and making sure that these questions are promulgated to all of our inspectors routinely. So we've really, I think, been consistently training our inspectors on every question that's come up. We'll definitely go back with the tablecloth and science inspector setup too, because that is, I think, pretty clever and one that a lot of folks will be able to use. So we hopefully will be more consistent than normal. We always strive to be a little bit consistent, but we definitely want to make sure that there is some uniform understanding of these. So yes, if there's a concern, anything I've said that varies from what your inspector tells you, definitely let us know, and we'll get that straightened out.
Great.
This has been great.
Thank you so much, Mr. Ross. We really appreciate your time. I don't think you understand how much we really do appreciate your time.
We're happy to talk again. And like I said, we're happy to answer questions. Feel free to reach out. We, both myself, Jocelyn Bjorsis, and the supervisors at licensing are always happy to talk to anybody. We want to make sure we're all excited to have you all open again. So it's, we're hoping this all works out well, and we'll do whatever we need to do to make sure everything's clear and everybody keeps safe.
Absolutely. Well, thank you
so much. And thank your daughter. She was darling.
Yes, she was.
I won't get her big head that way, but thank you.
And thank you so much for everyone that participated today on our call. Have a wonderful day. And again, you know how to reach out to us if we need to. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Good luck, everybody.